Hello, everyone. As part of the Diabetes Awareness Month, and for the last day of the Diabetes Awareness Month, I wanted to do a short recording on type 1 diabetes, insulin price, and patents. Why? First of all, because insulin is a vital good for us. Before the discovery of insulin in the 20s, type 1 diabetes could be diagnosed, but patients were put on a diet and they were quickly dying. So insulin has really been a game changer for type 1 diabetic people. We can live a normal life of checking your blood sugar or glucose level and injecting yourself insulin more than once a day. Probably is not really the definition of normal for a lot of people. Also, insulin allows us to live, and without it, we will have problems and die. But it has also potential adverse effects on us because sometimes, even if we do our best, it will put our glucose level very low or too high, and we have to jungle with that to manage the glucose level, the insulin we inject, the sport we do, the food we eat, the best we can, and there is never a perfect curve in a day, no matter how hard we try. So there is a lot of odds and random points, but we do with it. The second point is that in the US, insulin pricing has really increased, I think, in the last 10 years or a bit more. And some patients' advocacy groups started to claim that the reason insulin was so expensive and that there was no generic was because of patents. As a type 1 diabetic patient who works in patent field, but who also had access to insulin for free in different countries, depending on where I worked and live, I believe patents are not only the sole and the explaining reason to the excessive pricing of insulin in the US, and I wanted to provide some background to that. I do not say patents do not influence a medicine price. I do believe it is not the reason or the sole reason insulin is priced so excessively in the US. First of all, some background maybe. I never really had to care about the price of insulin until I lived in the UK. Why? Because in France and Belgium, when I worked there, I could get the insulin I needed without paying for it. So basically, France and Belgium have a public healthcare system where you contribute through your salary with the tax you pay. And in France, I think I was paying almost nothing, if not almost nothing or nothing at all to see a doctor with relation to my diabetes, or €1 when I was seeing a GP, something like that. In Belgium, you have to pay, but most of your medical costs are refunded later on. But for insulin, I never had to pay in any of those countries. When I arrived in the UK, the situation was a bit different because in the UK, I pay for the NHS and I can get insulin for free, but I can get insulin that do not really fit my glucose pattern, my curves, and they do not fulfill the requirements I need for an insulin. So basically, when I arrived in the UK, they didn't have the daily insulin I used. They had the night insulin because all type 1 diabetic patients have two types of insulin at least. The daily insulin and the background basal or night insulin that lasts 24 hours. So they had my night insulin, so I could get it for free from the NHS, but they gave me as daily insulin this one, and this was a disaster because it was not the one I was using in Belgium and France, and I'm very sensitive to it, so it put my glucose level very low even if I was injecting almost nothing, and if I was not injecting anything I was getting crazy high. And all the times I collapsed or I was close to collapsing because of a too low glucose level, it was because of this insulin. So at some point I just noticed it didn't work and I did not want to continue like this. And I decided to go back home to have my type 1 diabetes followed more closely by my previous practitioner when I was working there. And at some point she decided that we will change the basal insulin I was using. So she gave me, instead of this one and the one I was using before rather, we decided to get rid of this one. She gave me this one. So this one, for 10 pence, I pay €77, which is almost €8 per pen. And this lasts me for 5 months. Then we decided to have a better action of this one to change the night insulin or the background insulin, and we got this one instead of the one I was using before and that I could get for free through the NHS. This one is 5 cartridge. I paid 54 euro, which is a bit more than 10 euro per cartridge, and this lasts me for 2 months. Of course, each patient needs are different, so what lasts me for here 2 months and here 5 months may last more or less for other patients, so it's really depending on your needs. As she asked me if I could get them through the NHS, and at the time I started using those, the NHS was not rolling them out, they were still using this. Now they start using those more frequently and more often with patients, so it's possible that at some point, if I manage to lobby very well my GP or my hospital, I can get them for free. For the time being, it's still not the case. What happened is that I went to a pharmacy in the UK and I asked if I had to buy this and this here in the UK, how much would I pay? And they told me that for each box it would be a bit more than £100. So it's more expensive than where I buy them in Europe, but it's not the cost you would pay in the US. In the US, from what I have read, what I have heard from patients, and what I have checked, basically, a bit more than 10 years ago, the price of insulin started to increase and something like tripled, I think. So basically, a vial of insulin, which is probably the content you would have in this box, or at least this box, probably this one, I think, but not this. This one is maybe too low, was costing $300 for a patient. And you have to consider that you need at least 2 vials for a month, because you need your night insulin and your day insulin, which means $600. Some patients say that they pay monthly insulin supplies up to $1,300. And a study, but I think it's a bit old, evaluated that a patient pays in average $450 per month for insulin supply. So what has happened is that some people in the US could not pay for that, they could not afford it, and they died. However, some patients go to buy insulin in Canada or Mexico, where they pay between $25 and $50, from what I understand, which is much less than in the US, and which is much less than what I pay in Europe, because I'm not covered in Europe by the public healthcare system. And patient advocacy groups started claiming that the reason insulin is so expensive in the US is patents. I think it's wrong for 2 or 3 reasons. First one, there are patents and there are no generics either in Europe. Still, either we get our insulin for free, or we get it for a fee that is not $300 a box. It's much less. So saying it's patent fault, I think it's a bit easy, but it may be a bit misleading or not very deep as an argument. The second point is that although some people say that in the US you can patent almost anything and everything, contrary to Europe, which may be to some extent true, in the US, if you want a coverage for the 50 US states, you do just 1 US patent application. In Europe, you have to go to the European Patent Office, do a European patent application, and validate it in the countries where you want your protection to be extended to. So you will have renewal fees, you will have application fees, you will have translation fees per country, not just at European level. And I lived in France, UK, and Belgium. I never had to pay for insulin until I arrived in the UK, and it's a personal choice I made, because I could have continued with what the NHS was giving me, but wouldn't have been really good, for me at least. I have some hope that at some point I get the one I need through the NHS. But the 3 countries, UK, France, and Belgium, have a biotech and pharma industry, and France has, I think, an insulin manufacturer. So I cannot believe that a pharma company that produces insulin will not try to patent the discoveries they made in those countries. So I believe they are patented in France, Belgium, and the UK too. The other reason I'm not really convinced by the patent argument is that some of the insulin that were previously on the market and that were very old, like the one I was using as a kid, so more than 20 years ago, had their price tripled in a few years. And probably the patent coverage was no longer valid because they had more than 20 years commercialization. So I'm not really sure, just saying it's patents and this is why we like generics is a good reason. And the first reason I'm not very convinced by the patent argument is that you can pay the same drugs in Canada for $25, $50. And in Canada, I cannot believe it's not patented. Some patient advocacy groups say that basically Dr. Banting, when he discovered insulin, gave away the patent for $1. I'm happy to believe that, but the patent that was covering insulin in the 1920s is totally different from the patents that cover insulin today. Why? Because first of all, insulin in the 20s was animal insulin extracted from an animal pancreas and purified. Today we have human insulin produced through manufacturing process, industrial, I think. It's chemical, it's not based on animals, so it's totally different. So the patents that were covering insulin in the 1920s do no longer cover the insulin that exists. And also as a patient, when I see the difference between this night insulin and the one I was using before, or this day insulin and this one, there have been a real progress, investment, and research to make the product different and more adapted to specific patients' needs. So there is research and development involved, so there are patents, but those patents are not the same as those that existed 20 years ago or 40 years ago or in the 20s. It does not mean, though, that I approve the fact that insulin is priced so expensively. But the difference between Europe, UK, and the US, I believe, lies in the fact that in Europe and the UK, we have a public healthcare system, which means that each country has its own government paying for the drugs or accepting to cover the cost or up to certain cost for the drugs. It doesn't exist in the US. You have the Obamacare, but I think it's for really poor people, and a lot of people do not fit the Obamacare. So basically, in France or Belgium or the UK, the government can negotiate the price with the manufacturer and say, we will not pay for more than that, or we do not accept to refund more than that. So there is a price constraint on insulin. And I think the real difference between the US, Europe, and the UK is not patents, it's the fact that we have public healthcare system that put some constraints and limits on pharma drugs. Some states in the US have introduced a price gouging legislation to try to avoid and cap to avoid excessive insulin pricing, or drugs pricing, sorry. So I believe this would apply to insulin too. And I am aware patents play a role in a product, including in a drug pricing, but for the reason I explained, I'm not really convinced this is the case for the insulin expense that have increased so much and that are so crazy. I find it a bit sad that a good that is vital to us is priced so high, but I'm not convinced it's fully or totally or only the fault of the patent system.